If you want to understand Amish gardening, start in February, not July. That is the whole mindset. Most backyard gardeners judge a garden by how it looks in midsummer. The rows are green, the flowers are pretty, the fruit is coming on, the seed catalog pictures feel alive. Amish families think differently. They judge a garden by what is still feeding the household when the snow is on the ground, the pantry is getting thin, and February has worn out everybody's patience. That changes everything. It changes what gets planted. It changes how much space each crop earns. It changes what gets celebrated and what gets left out on purpose. And it changes the very question behind the garden. The question is not, what looks good in August? The question is, what still helps in February? That is why many Amish gardeners skip some crops that other people love. Not because those crops are bad, not because they are wrong. They simply do not pull their weight when you measure them by calories, storage life, and winter usefulness. And once you see that logic, a lot of gardening advice starts to make less sense. So let me walk you through 7 vegetables and crops that Amish gardeners often pass by and why they do it. Then I will show you what they put in that space instead. And at the end, I want to give you an old storage trick for cabbage that can keep heads crisp for months, even if you do not have a root cellar. Here is the first thing to understand. Amish gardens are not built for variety alone. They are built for survival, stretching, and continuity. A good harvest is not just one full basket. A good harvest is a pantry that keeps paying you back after the weather turns ugly. That means calories matter. It means storage matters. It means the best crop is not always the prettiest crop. Sometimes the best crop is the one that looks plain, handles rough weather, and stays useful long after the first frost. Sweet corn is the first crop they often reject for this reason. People love sweet corn because it tastes like summer. Fresh ears, dripping with butter, are hard to beat. But when you grow sweet corn in a backyard, you are usually buying a lot of space for a very short return. It takes room. It needs a good block for pollination. It gives you a short harvest window. Then it is over. That is the problem. Sweet corn is a feast, not a pantry staple. It fills you up for a day. It does not carry the household through the winter. A patch of sweet corn can feel generous when the ears are ready. A few weeks later, it is just a field of drying stalks where space could have been feeding you in a much more serious way. Amish gardeners often look at that same ground and think of potatoes. Potatoes are not flashy. Nobody frames a potato patch for Instagram. But potatoes are dense, dependable, and forgiving. They give you a lot more food energy from the same square footage. In practical calorie terms, potatoes usually return several times more winter value from the same ground than sweet corn does. And potatoes store. That matters more than people realize. You can dig them, cure them, and keep them around for weeks or months in the right conditions. They become soup, hash, roast potatoes, mashed potatoes, and filling for a cold night when fresh produce is gone. Sweet corn does not do that. Sweet corn is a celebration. Potatoes are insurance. There is another reason the potato wins. Sweet corn has a very tight timing window. If you miss the right stage, the flavor drops fast. The sugars in the kernels start turning to starch, and the corn gets less tender by the hour. Potatoes, on the other hand, can stay in the ground longer, get dug in batches, and be handled on your schedule if the weather cooperates. That makes the crop more forgiving for a busy family. It also makes it more realistic for a household that is not trying to manage a hobby. Amish gardens are part of a system. The garden has to fit the rest of life. Chores do not stop for a patch of corn that wants attention every day for a narrow harvest window. Now, if you love sweet corn, I am not telling you to never grow it. I am telling you how Amish logic ranks crops. Sweet corn is a luxury crop. Potatoes are a work crop. If your land is limited, the work crop wins. The second crop they often skip is cauliflower. Cauliflower is a fine vegetable. I have nothing against it, but it is a fussy one. It wants timing. It wants steady weather. It dislikes heat. It dislikes a sudden cold snap. It can button up, loosen, discolor, or simply stall out if conditions are not just right. That is a bad deal if your goal is dependable winter food. Cauliflower can look beautiful when it succeeds. But when it succeeds is the key phrase. It asks for more care than most gardeners want to give it, and it gives a smaller payoff than a good head of cabbage. In a practical garden, that math is hard to justify. Cabbage is the better trade. Cabbage is sturdy. Cabbage is plain in the best sense. Cabbage does not need to impress anybody. It just grows. It handles cool weather better. It can sit in the ground longer. It can be harvested when you need it. It can be sliced into slaw, cooked into soup, fermented into sauerkraut, or stored for later. And unlike cauliflower, cabbage gives you volume. That is what winter cooking needs. Not delicacy, volume. One large cabbage head can become a meal, a side dish, and a second-day soup. 2 or 3 heads can feed a family through several meals without feeling like you are scraping the bottom of the bin. Cauliflower tends to disappear in a single dinner. There is also a reason Amish gardeners trust cabbage more than many modern gardeners do. Cabbage is not glamorous, but it is hard to kill. That makes it valuable in a climate where you cannot afford to babysit every square foot. If a crop needs perfect weather, it is already asking too much. If a crop can keep growing through rougher conditions, it earns its place. And cabbage gives you another advantage that cauliflower rarely does. It stores. A good cabbage head can hold its shape, its crunch, and a lot of its usefulness for a long time if you handle it well. It is one of those crops that rewards patience twice. First in the garden, then again in storage. The third crop many of them leave out is eggplant. Eggplant has its fans, and I understand why. It is rich, it can be grilled well, and in the right kitchen it makes a fine dish. But from a practical standpoint, eggplant asks for warmth, time, and attention. It does not always reward that effort with a lot of food. A healthy eggplant plant may give you a handful of good fruits over the season. Maybe 6, maybe 8. Sometimes a little more if everything goes right. That is not terrible. But it is not impressive either when you compare it to crops that fill pots, buckets, jars, or bins. An eggplant is not a strong winter keeper. You can preserve it in some ways, of course. You can cook and freeze it. You can use it in sauces. But it is not the kind of crop that sits on a shelf in good shape for months, waiting for February to arrive. It is a summer crop with a narrow purpose. Amish gardeners often prefer zucchini instead, or another summer squash, when they want that kind of warm weather production. Zucchini grows fast. It produces heavily. It can be grated, sliced, cooked, frozen, pickled, or shared with neighbors before it gets too big. It may not be a perfect winter crop either, but it gives a much stronger return on the same amount of space and attention. There is also a weather issue here. Eggplant wants heat for a long stretch. Not just warm days, warm nights too. In many places, especially farther north, that means a short season of waiting before the plants even get going. Then you still have to protect them from cool nights that slow everything down. Zucchini is not fussy in the same way. Once it gets going, it moves. It is one of the crops that can quietly overflow your kitchen if you are not paying attention. That can be a problem in its own way, but it is the good kind of problem. Too much food is easier to solve than too little. And when Amish families are planning for winter, a summer crop has to prove itself quickly. Eggplant often does not. The fourth crop they often pass on is Brussels sprouts. This one surprises some people because Brussels sprouts are technically a cool weather crop. But the issue is not just the temperature. It is the amount of ground they occupy versus the food they produce. A Brussels sprouts plant can stand in the garden for a long time. It can take you from spring into late fall. It can occupy space like it pays rent. Then, after all that waiting, you get a modest amount of edible sprouts from a single stalk. That is the problem again. Long wait, small payoff. If you are trying to feed a family through winter, you do not want a crop that occupies a bed for months and hands back a small basket. Amish gardeners look at that same space and often think, I could have grown a big cabbage head there. I could have grown potatoes there. I could have grown beans or squash there. That is not a knock on Brussels sprouts as a food. It is a judgment on efficiency. The Amish gardening ethic is efficient by nature. The land has to justify itself. The crop has to earn its place. Brussels sprouts often fail that test, especially when the goal is winter bulk. A single good cabbage can sometimes do the job of several Brussels sprout plants in the kitchen. That is why cabbage wins. There is another practical issue too. Brussels sprouts can look like they are giving you a lot because the plant is tall and busy, but the edible part is still fairly small. You spend the whole season looking at leaves and stem, then harvesting a modest number of tight little buds. It feels productive. It is not always as productive as it seems. That is a bad bargain for a household that wants certainty. The fifth crop is artichokes. Artichokes are beautiful. There is no denying that. They have a striking look, and in some regions, they can be a serious culinary crop. But in most American backyard settings, they are a poor fit for a winter pantry garden. They are huge plants. They take up a lot of room, and for the amount of space they use, they often give you only a few edible buds. That is exactly the kind of crop Amish gardeners tend to call decorative or garnish-like. It may be interesting. It may be impressive. It may be fun to grow once, but it is not the backbone of a practical food system. If you are trying to fill a table in February, artichokes do not carry enough weight. They are not a storage crop. They are not a calorie crop. They are not a crop that makes a cellar look full. They are a crop that makes the garden look fancy, and fancy does not keep you fed. This is where Amish thinking is especially useful. It strips away the romantic layer. It asks a blunt question. Does this crop feed people well enough to deserve the space? If the answer is no, it gets cut. That same question is why they are often unimpressed by fancy lettuce mixes. Fresh greens are wonderful. I like a salad as much as the next man, but salad greens are mostly water. They are tender. They are short-lived. They wilt quickly. They bruise easily. They do not sit on a shelf and help you through February. Fancy lettuce mixes may look charming in a bowl. They may taste nice on a warm day, but if you are planning for winter, they are one of the weakest investments you can make in a garden bed. You are spending prime space on leaves that disappear almost as soon as you cut them. That is not bad gardening. It is just soft gardening. Amish gardeners often move that space toward cabbage instead. Why cabbage again? Because cabbage is basically a salad with staying power. You can shred it fresh, you can ferment it, you can cook it, you can store it. You can keep it in cool conditions much longer than lettuce. A head of cabbage is not just food. It is a food base. It can be dressed up or dressed down. It can become a quick side or a full meal. Lettuce is a guest. Cabbage is a resident. That is the difference. And if you have ever been hungry in late winter, you already understand why that matters. Nobody complains about not having a tender lettuce leaf in February if the pantry is full of cabbage, potatoes, and onions. The seventh crop is the decorative pumpkin, especially the big jack-o'-lantern type. This one catches people every year. They are huge. They look impressive on the vine. They fill a corner of the yard like a seasonal sculpture. Children love them. Holiday displays love them. But the flesh is often watery, bland, and not very useful for long storage or serious cooking. That is not the kind of pumpkin Amish families want if they are planning for winter. They want winter squash. Butternut is a favorite in many places. Hubbard is another solid option. Those kinds of squash are dense, richer, and much more useful in storage. They can sit on a shelf for months in the right conditions. They hold up in soups, roasts, mashes, and baked dishes. They bring actual food value, not just size. That is the issue with jack-o'-lantern pumpkins. They look big, but they are not built for the pantry. A winter squash patch, on the other hand, can quietly become a shelf full of food. That is the kind of result Amish gardeners want. They are not interested in growing a giant orange decoration that turns soft in a week. They are interested in growing food that can sit there and still matter when the weather is cold and the work is harder. There is a deep logic behind that choice too. Winter squash is one of those crops that rewards you after curing. Once the skin hardens properly, the storage life improves. That means the harvest is not over when you cut it from the vine. The harvest is still continuing as the squash sits and holds. That is the kind of patient food system that fits a winter-minded garden. Now, once you understand these 7 choices, the larger pattern becomes obvious. Amish gardening is not about growing the widest variety of vegetables possible. It is about growing the most useful ones possible. That means calories over decoration, storage over novelty, reliability over drama. A crop does not have to be exciting. It has to be useful. That is why the biggest beds often go to potatoes, cabbage, winter squash, onions, and dry beans. Those are the crops that change the household. Potatoes are your bulk. Cabbage is your volume and your flexibility. Winter squash is your shelf life. Onions are your flavor base. Dry beans are your protein and your long-game food. That is a serious pantry. And notice what is missing. There is no room for crops that vanish fast, occupy too much land, or spend all season looking pretty while doing too little. Amish gardeners are ruthless about that. Not cruel, just clear-eyed. Every square foot has to pay rent. That is the part most modern gardeners need to hear, because it is very easy to get distracted by novelty. A seed catalog can make almost anything look irresistible. Purple carrots, tiny melons, giant tomatoes, rainbow lettuces, rare squash, exotics that sound exciting in March and disappointing by October. A winter garden asks a harder question. What will actually matter when the weather turns cold and the grocery bill is climbing? If you only have a small backyard, you can use that same idea. Give the most space to the crops that store well and keep feeding you. Put the prettiest crops in a smaller section. That way your garden still has joy, but it also has a purpose. If space is tight, I would think in this order. Put your largest beds into potatoes and cabbage. Give a good run to winter squash if you have room for vines. Use onions where you can tuck them in. Use dry beans if you want something that stores dry and feeds hard. And then, if you still want a little sweet corn, or a few fancy greens, or an eggplant or two, you can grow them as a treat, not as the foundation. That is the Amish logic in plain English. They do not garden for the catalog. They garden for the pantry. They do not ask, what gives the prettiest summer picture? They ask, what will we be glad we planted when February arrives? That question changes everything you plant. It changes how you lay out your beds. It changes what gets the best ground. It changes what you bother to water, weed, and protect. And it changes your expectations. Because a winter-minded garden is not supposed to impress your neighbors in June. It is supposed to make your kitchen feel steady when the world outside is bare. Now let me give you that old cabbage storage trick, because it is too useful to leave out. I learned this from an older woman connected to an Amish community years ago. She did not have a fancy root cellar. She did not need one. She handled cabbage with quiet, old-fashioned discipline. She would take each head and wrap it in 3 layers of dry newspaper. Not damp paper, dry newspaper. Then she would place the wrapped heads in a plain cardboard box. Then she would store that box in a cool, unheated place. A front entry, a back porch room, a storage closet, a mudroom. A place that stays cold, but does not freeze solid. The ideal temperature is right around 32 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0 to 7 degrees Celsius. That is the sweet spot. Too warm and the cabbage softens faster. Too cold and it can freeze and damage the texture. But in that cool range, the heads can stay crisp and usable for a long time. Sometimes well into March, if the room stays steady and the cabbages were good to begin with. There are a few small rules that make this work better. Do not wash the cabbage before storage. Keep the outer leaves on unless they are damaged badly. Check the box every so often for any head that shows soft spots or mold. Use the most perfect heads first and leave the strongest ones for later. That is the kind of storage method that does not require expensive equipment. It does not need a root cellar. It does not need a machine. It needs a cool room, dry newspaper, and a little respect for the crop. And if you want to make it even more reliable, choose dense heads with tight leaves at harvest time. Those are the heads that hold best. Loose heads are more vulnerable. A firm cabbage has already done half the work for you before it ever reaches the box. That is also why cabbage matters so much in winter planning. You can grow it, harvest it, and then let it keep working for you long after the rest of the garden has gone to sleep. That is a real advantage. And it is the kind of advantage Amish gardeners care about more than almost anything else. So if you want to think like they do, start here. Ask what your family will need when fresh vegetables are scarce. Ask what stores well. Ask what gives the most food from the least ground. Ask what can sit on a shelf, in a box, or in a cool room and still taste good later. Then build your garden around those answers. That is why sweet corn gets pushed aside. That is why cauliflower loses to cabbage. That is why eggplant, Brussels sprouts, artichokes, fancy lettuce, and decorative pumpkins all fall down the list. And that is why potatoes, cabbage, winter squash, onions, and dry beans rise to the top. The garden that feeds you in February is a very different garden from the one that photographs well in July. And if you get that part right, the rest starts to make sense. You stop chasing novelty. You stop wasting prime ground on weak returns. You stop treating the garden like a summer hobby and start treating it like a winter system. That shift is bigger than it sounds. Because once you think that way, every row has a job. Every bed has a purpose. Every harvest has a destination. Nothing is planted just to be admired for a week and forgotten. You will walk into your storage space and see bins of potatoes, boxes of cabbage, onions hanging nearby, and winter squash lined up on the shelf like quiet little promises. The garden will not just be something you remember. It will be something you can still taste. You will peel back the newspaper, cut into a head that is still crisp, and remember that the real harvest was never the pretty summer view. It was this. And when February gets long, and the roads are gray, and the fresh produce in the store starts looking tired, that is when the difference shows up. That is when a practical garden feels wise. That is when a cabbage head, wrapped in newspaper, feels like a small victory. That is when potatoes, squash, and beans remind you that the best garden is not always the loudest one. It is the one that still feeds you after the season has ended. If you want, the next topic should be the easiest storage crops for a small basement, garage, or closet, because that is where winter gardening really pays off.